We are going to talk today about solving complicated equations. The process we're going to talk about is called undoing. So we're going to look at what operation the equation is doing, and we're going to undo all of that. So the first one is actually an equation that we've looked at before. It's just a little bit harder and a little bit like there's more steps involved than there was before. So next to it, we're going to take some notes. So this is an absolute value equation. So what's special about an absolute value equation is that we actually end up with two solutions. The first step we need to make sure we're doing is we need to get that absolute value alone. So as soon as I write that, so our goal is to get this 3x minus 6 all by itself. So we're going to undo all of that by using our railroad tracks just like normal. So we're going to get rid of this minus 1 first. So we are going to add 1 to both sides. And we have 2 times the absolute value of 3x minus 6 equals 10. And then we need to get rid of that 2 in front. So since it's 2 times the absolute value, we're going to divide by 2. And we end up with the absolute value of 3x minus 6 equals 5. So now this is similar to what our equations looked like when we were doing absolute value. So we need to split this into two equations. And the way we do that is we leave the inside the same. So this 3x minus 6 is going to be the same. The 5 is going to be what changes. So we're going to have 1 for positive 5 and then 1 for negative 5. So what I like to do is draw a set of arrows so that we make sure we remember our two equations. So we have 3x minus 6 equals 5. And we have 3x minus 6 equals negative 5. So from there, we are going to solve. We're going to add 6 to both sides, and we have 3x equals 11, and then divide by 3. So we have x equals 11 thirds. And we're going to do the same on this side. So we have 3x equals 1, and again, divide by 3, and we have x equals 1 third. All right, so that's absolute value. The next one we are going to write is going to be for squared. So our squared value is going to be what we need to get by itself. So we're going to call this perfect square form. Again, for this one, the majority of the time, we are going to have two solutions. Okay, and again, our first step is going to be getting that squared by itself. So in this case, our goal is to get that x plus 1 squared by itself. So our first step, again, we're going to split this into our railroad tracks. We're going to get rid of that adding 5 by subtracting 5. So we have 3 times x plus 1 squared, and that equals 75. Then we need to get rid of that 3 in front, so we're going to divide both sides by 3, and we have x plus 1 squared equals 25. Then we are going to get rid of that squared, and this is where we end up with our two equations. So when we square root both sides, we are going to have one positive and one negative. So very similar to what we just did for that absolute value. So we're going to square root both sides. So that means we know the inside part, so that x plus 1 could either be 5 or that inside part could be negative 5. And then we just finish solving, so we get x equals 4 and x equals negative 6. Okay, then our last one we have here is going to be a square root equation. Okay, our first step is that we need to get the square root alone. So same steps as before, we are going to subtract our 10 on both sides here. So we have the square root of x minus 5 equals 5. And then our next step is going to be to square both sides. And I guess before you do that, we need to check the sign of our answer. So what I mean by that is if this 5 was a negative 5, you cannot take the square root of something and get a negative answer. So if you have the square root equals a negative, that's going to tell you no solution. And that's really the case for all three of these examples. So you're going to make sure that you're kind of making sense of those answers. If we have the square root equaling a positive number, then you're going to have a solution. So once we square both sides, the square and the square root cancel each other out. So we have x minus 5. And then on this side, 5 squared is 25. We only have one solution here because if we take the square root of negative 25, we would get no solution. So we only have our one option there. And then to finish this guy off, we're going to add our 5 to both sides. So for this example, we would have x equals 30.